used to where they sat and did the assembly. Co-ed seating is more of a modern concept. Even when you go to the Middle East today, the women usually sit over there and the men usually sit over here. So I hope that that's at least somewhat of an answer, but it's just that we just don't have examples today. We just don't have examples today. Now, y'all look, this ain't a class on instrumental music. I just mentioned that in passing. Okay. Yes, sir. I can't hear you, brother. Right.
If you're going to
Uh-huh.
There were about 200 people in my mother's family. When she passed in 1988, your church was saying they had a brother up there that could get more out of you than you thought you would.
Mm-hmm.
There were about co-workers in her church. And some of them, which people, they said, I can't come here for you all on that. They heard that singing. One lady was in my office the next day, she was hyperventilating. She could hardly express herself over that singing. That was an opportunity to say, that's what the Lord is.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so we've had, for those who are watching this post class today, we've just had two comments regarding instruments and instrumental music, and that's good. That's good. But I will say we have a lot of energy around those kinds of things. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get us some energy around what I'm going to talk about this morning. All right, instruments is easy. That's a piece of cake. This stuff right here, this more difficult. All right. So they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. In other words, whatever the apostles laid out, that's what they did. There were only how many apostles? 12. Who was the 13th? Huh? Who was the later apostle? Paul. Okay. So we know that the lot fell on Matthias in Acts 1 and Acts 2, okay? But my point is that those were the apostles. We do not have any apostles as we understand apostles today. The apostles, this is a unique group of guys that actually broke bread, had time, saw Jesus directly. Okay, so there is preeminence to what these guys say. Fellowship literally has to do with intimate relationship. It is not us just sitting down, drinking some Kool-Aid, having a piece of cake and eating some spaghetti. If that is the crux of our fellowship, we have done the Bible a misjustice. All right. Fellowship is literally, and in ancient time, when you sat down and you shared with someone, it was a sacred experience. It was sacred. So when you sat down and you broke bread with someone, that was a big deal. Some of us remember from our younger days, it used to be like that. If a lot of us grew up in the South, I mean, you broke bread. There was just something special about that coming together. That's how it was in the early church. And the breaking of bread, some discussion here, is this having to do with the meal or having to do the Lord's Supper? And in prayers. Okay. All right. So let's keep going. Verse 43. And fear, the word awe, came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. You're going to see this happen in the early church as the gospel is going to be spread. These guys had with them a tremendous amount of power to do what we would call today miraculous things. Okay, let's keep on. And all that believed were together and had all things common. There was a heightened degree of unity and togetherness in the Lord's church. So this fragmented, broken style of serving God, that's not really reflected in the scriptures. All right. Well, Brother Emerson, I just don't get along. You're not getting along because you're choosing not to get along. John 17, when Jesus was on the cross, the Holy Spirit, Jesus' opinion, everything that we need to be unified at a significant level, we already have. If you're not fitting into the church, you don't want to fit in. And can't nobody make you fit in. We can invite you. We can model that for you. We can create ways to include you. But if you don't want to do this thing at a significant way, nobody's going to force you. But again, let me tell you, are we doing Bible things Bible ways? Everything about you needs to reek of togetherness, fellowship, unity. The members of the church ought to be the biggest cheerleaders for the Figueroa congregation. Let's keep on going. 45. Acts 2, 4. All right. Woo, Lord have mercy. Here we go. Here we go right here. But Emerson, I was with you till Acts 2:45. And they did what? Sold their possessions. We are the most covetous, greedy generation probably that's ever lived. And I'm including myself in all that as well. They sold their possessions and goods. Well, Brother Emerson, they didn't have the social types of structures that we have today. Well, yeah, you're probably right, but God's people have never relied on the world to do things that God expects us to do. We can't do something based on what the world does. Let me just park right here. At the Schrader Lane Church of Christ, where David Jones was a minister for many years, he's now retired. I tell you, these old guys, when they step down, man, it's just so much that leaves us. And I remember he had these 4 leadership sessions that he would do. And for those of us who were younger or just wanted to learn about church growth and church development, you would bring your leadership and you would come and you would sit with him for a weekend. I was able to get my guys to go to 3 or 4. This is when I was living in Ohio. And I'm telling you, I was just so inspired by what I saw. One of the things that he had a weekend where he talked about money. At least that's what I remember him talking about. And he talked about how their church did not believe in government financing. Now, he said he's not going to go as far as to say that that's sinful. He's just talking about the way that they did things. Schrader Lane, in terms of campuses, has our most developed campus at our fellowship. They have a senior citizens home that they pay cash for. They have a gymnasium and classrooms and multi-purpose rooms. As he was getting ready to retire, they bought enough acreage to build their own campground. I mean, you talk about somebody who just had a totally different mentality, and he was able to bring that kind of thinking to the Lord's people. We are richer now than any generation that's ever existed in the church. When you see things falling down and falling apart in most of our congregations, it's not because we don't have the money. It's because our money is not being stewarded properly. And I don't mean no harm. It's not being stewarded properly. Notice, they sold and they gave to everybody. Are we doing Bible things Bible ways? Now y'all got excited about that instrument. Y'all quiet now. Y'all quiet now. And they parted them to every man You know, some people we don't give to because we don't think they deserve it. You got to work just like I do. Look, there were poor people in ancient time. It's going to be poor people until Jesus come back. And you can't possibly look into every family and compare their situation to your situation. God has blessed more of us. We have more money than our parents and grandparents had 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 times over. And yet they gave more than we did. My grandma was one of probably the first millionaires. I really need to do a documentary on her life. My grandmother was her own mission. She had missionaries all over the world. I remember going to see my grandmother. We always hated to go see her because she was always working. It's like, man, grandma, can't we just sit and I remember I came up one day, she had this big old black pot out in the yard. I said, oh Lord, what's grandma doing now? My grandmother was boiling soap, taking old sheets, washing those sheets, hanging those sheets, and sending those sheets all over the world to people who needed bedding. I'm just saying, people just committed to serving others. My grandmother, you were hungry in Temple, Oklahoma. That's where she spent a lot of her time. My grandmother had her garage set up like a benevolence place. I mean, you walk in her garage, if you needed cereal, if you needed frozen meat, if you needed canned goods, if you needed fresh fruit and vegetables, you came right in there with your family and you got as much as you needed and then you left. My grandmother really, for the most part, was an unofficial mayor of the city. So what are you saying? I'm saying this kind of practice is possible today. We just have to hold each other, just like y'all would hold me and Hawkins to that whole instrumental thing. I want you to hold us. I want us to hold each other to this. Parted them to all men as every man had need. All right, 46. And they continuing. How often did they get together? Daily. The temple here is a place of gathering. They would have had that place. They would have assembled together not once a week, daily. Breaking bread from where? Ooh. Homework. They did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart. So this is what early New Testament Christianity looked like. And so as we're trying to re-explore our roots and engaging families in our community, this needs to be our goal. This needs to be what we aim for. Going to verse 47. Praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church how often? What we can probably suggest about our lack of evangelistic fervor today is that we just might not be doing Bible things Bible ways and we're not getting Bible results. All right, now let's go over to Galatians chapter 1. And let me show you what this looks like. All right, so I'm leaving Acts 2. And what I'm seeking to do is I'm trying to engage you in a substantive way around our practice of what we are perceiving as New Testament Christianity. And I'm suggesting to you that what we practice today in some ways is not necessarily what we read in the scriptures. And I'm wanting you to conclude some things about your faith, your New Testament Christian practice, and I'm trying to spur you to be more in line with what the Bible shares. All right. So those are some things that I wanted you to have concluded from looking at Acts 2:42 through 47. Now, part of why this approach is a little difficult is because this is more of I don't want to say more of a strong arm kind of approach, but it's kind of like in your face. It's just kind of like, if you're like really listening and you're really a student, you're going to be convicted if you haven't been doing these things. The problem today is we often don't like that kind of preaching. We like more conversational, more friendly, more relational kind of preaching. And that's probably the kind of person I am, but you can't have that kind of diet all the time. Sometimes you have to be put in the positions. Sometimes your preacher, your minister who's teaching you needs to put you in a position where you got to make some changes. And he's not doing his job if he does not push you to think about what we're doing. So here we are in the book of Galatians chapter 1. The church is new, brand spanking new. The apostles are still alive. So, we talk about over 2,000 years ago. Galatia is the name of a region. It's not the name of a city like Corinth. It's the name of a region. So whenever you read the book of Galatians, more than likely you're talking about some gathering of thoughts of what was happening in the region. So how they would do evangelism is that Peter, Paul, whoever the apostle is, they would go to an area, more than likely Paul, and they would preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. What they would try to do is get as close as they can to what we read in Acts chapter 2. And if you stay with Acts chapter 2, you're going to see some of the more simpler elements of what we call the gospel today. And it had a lot of bearing on what people in the Jewish and pagan or non-Jewish community did. For example, with regard to serving God, both groups served what they perceived as God. The Jews had a unique way of serving God. Prior to Jesus, it revolved around the keeping of the 10 Commandments, following certain observances, the day of Sabbath. They were very strict in how you do it. In the pagan world, they had some of those same things, but they were very different. I mean, in some instances, they were burning kids. They were, just doing some crazy things. So in comes the gospel, and the gospel transcends both systems. So there's no syncretism here. When we're trying to embrace syncretism, we're trying to bring together elements of what we currently do with New Testament Christianity. This is why in certain parts of the world, when you go and you look at Christianity, it has certain elements of paganism. I remember watching Miles Monroe, he is deceased now, was a big preacher in the islands. And I remember sitting down. You all know how to have this whole spiritual warfare thing and all that. So I'm real acute to when I see certain phrases or I see certain images, it's just almost like something goes off in my head. And I can see that there's something going on that's beyond what everybody's seeing. So he had taken a cross and he used that cross like an amulet. Now, if you do sorcery, witchcraft, you'll know that those people associate power with certain things. So it could be a rock, it could be some type of miniature figurine of something. That's straight out of Witchcraft 101. A lot of times you go in people's offices, you'll see figurines of things, you'll see certain pictures. You don't know what you're looking at. You're looking at an altar. And this is how these people are worshiping their gods. I remember sitting at the bank one time, and I'm sitting at the bank, and then my eyes look up, and I'm looking at the teller. She looked just like a witch. just like a witch. Now, if you didn't look at her with that kind of way, you wouldn't even notice. You would have thought that the makeup and her hair and her jewelry and all that stuff, you would have thought, oh, okay, well, she's kind of macabre. No, Sister Girl is a witch. I mean, she was a bona fide witch. I mean, I recognize some of the charms and her jewelry and just all that. So I'm listening to Miles Monroe, and he talks about this cross, and he talks about it just like it's an amulet. He talked about praying to it. He was leading a chant around it. That's called syncretism, where you take elements of paganistic practices and you weave them into Christianity. Well, for the people that come out of that culture, Christianity is more palatable because now it has certain elements of their native religion. Y'all are looking at me like I'm crazy. Y'all all right? You're just listening, right? All right. So in Galatia, you had the apostles coming to preach the gospel. One of the big issues is, what do you do around people who are not Jewish people? How do you treat them? Now, if you are a Jew, and for the most part, initially Christianity was considered a shoot off of Judaism. It wasn't, but that's how many of them looked at it. So if you go to your Judeo roots, you're not supposed to be breaking bread with people who don't follow the law of Moses. There were very, very strict rules around how you connected with them. This is why there's so much angst here in this text around Peter and Paul, and how Peter and Paul interact with these people who don't know the Lord. Paul is saying, these are our brothers and sisters in Christ. There is no more of this distinction and division with our being Jewish and their not being Jewish. That's the old way of looking at things. Now we're all sitting at the same table. We are joint heirs with Christ. Peter had that thing all wrong. Peter, when the Judaizers from Jerusalem would come around, Peter was more strict in his New Testament practice. And he didn't sit down with people who weren't Jews. But when them guys weren't around, Peter was just like Paul. Peter was being two-faced. And Paul took him to task on how he's confusing people who are members of the church who really need to see more of a unified, coherent way, and they're not. Now, this is Peter and Paul. So how difficult is it going to be some 2,000 years later for us to try to do it? So I'm saying it was hard for them. It's going to be hard for us. But it doesn't mean that it's difficult so we can't do it. It just means we have to be more intentional about what we do. So Galatians 1:6, Paul, an apostle, not of men, neither by man. I marvel, Paul says, that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. Grace tends to be associated with the way that God relates to humankind. It is God's grace that brought about the scheme of redemption to bring man back to him. Paul is saying, Peter, you know that it's because of grace that any of us can stand here in this setting. But he says, I'm just shocked that we have so quickly redefined things. Watch this now. Well, what we are practicing is a gospel of a different kind. That's what that phrase literally means. So think, if you will, if I had an orange and an apple. These are both pieces of fruit, but they're different kinds of fruit. An apple and an orange you can both peel and eat, but they're two totally different pieces of fruit. So this is what Paul is saying. What you're following, Peter, is a gospel of a different kind. Verse 7. Which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul says there is only one gospel. There is only one gospel. There is only one way of serving and relating to the Lord that is proper and that is appropriate. Now, for my friends today who are members of the church, who've become so swayed and enamored by denominationalism, I want to take you to this passage. And it's not just them, it's even within the Lord's church and how we relate to and serve the Lord. We can be just as guilty as them. Notice, which is not another, but there be some, these are the Judaizers that trouble you. And the Judaizers are reflective of this group that they are just having difficulty around making some elements of the faith real and practical today. And the challenge is you always have people like that around. They would take what I'm going to share with you and they would talk it down, and then they would find other people who feel the same way, and they would just kind of reaffirm this backwardness. Paul said that is exactly what was going on with the Judaizers. The Judaizers would get together and they would continue to talk to and convince themselves that they were just like they've been. They're better than the pagans. They are better than these people who aren't Jewish. So why are you sitting with them? That's wrong. And the reason that Paul is getting ready to take Peter to task is because Peter was wrong. Peter was wrong to act one way around the Judaizers and one way when they weren't around. Paul says you have perverted or distorted the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let's keep on. Verse 8. But though we, or an angel here is messenger, one who shares and proclaims God's word. That's what angels do. Angels typically are more task-oriented beings. In this instance, but though we are an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, Paul says, y'all love him. What'd he say? Let him be accursed. So if we have a way of serving God that's not like we see it in the Bible, Paul here pulls no punches. Paul says literally, let everything that could be damnable be thrust upon them, because they are perverting the gospel of Jesus Christ. And these guys treated the gospel like Moses did with the 10 Commandments. And when you go back and you read that 10 Commandments and Mount Sinai and the angels and the divine council and all that, that was really something special. They treated the gospel in the same way. You cannot take the gospel and pervert it. You cannot make it something that it's not. You cannot twist it to fit in the current mold that you're wanting to embrace today. Paul says, if you do that, let me, let him, let her be accursed. Let's go on, verse 9. As we said before, so I say now. Again, and when the Bible repeats something, when it goes out of its way to say something again a couple of different ways, you want to pay close attention to it. Because it's not there for window dressing. This is important. Paul says, as we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach, there that phrase is, a gospel of a different kind unto you than that ye have received, Paul says, let him be accursed. I love the emphatic nature of that language. In an era where we seem to be in love with certain ways of presenting things, that's not Paul. Paul says, man, look, if you got some folk following you, teaching you rather to follow the Lord in a way that we don't see in the scriptures, let him be accursed. All right, my time is up. So next week, we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 11. And I'm going to show you what it looks like when Acts 2 and Galatians 1 are employed. And it's around the Lord's Supper. And I want to encourage us to look at how we practice the Lord's Supper. And I want to ask us, are we doing it like they did it in the Bible? So that's going to be on next week. So if you were here today, then you got a really good kind of segue into where we're going. So this is a series on homework. By homework, we're talking about what should be transpiring in our home, in our places of abode, as we are contemplating reaching out and engaging families, newer families, potential members of the Figueroa congregation. So any questions today about what I've shared? Any questions today about what I've shared?